Between 1932 and 1933, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union created a state-induced famine in Ukraine. It became known as the Holodomor, which translates to death by hunger in Ukrainian. During that time, tons of food and lives went to waste as millions of people slowly succumbed to starvation. If this doesn't sound familiar to you, well, that's by design. The engineers of the tragedy did their best to erase it from history, and total denial of the event still persists, even in modern times.
So guys, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon, never miss an update. So without wasting your time, so let's begin and watch the end.
For now, prepare to get mad at Stalin. Well, more mad, anyway. We don't need to convince you that Russia and Ukraine have a complex and harsh history together. Ukraine is located right at the crossroads of Central Asia, Russia, Europe, and the Black Sea. While the people in these surrounding areas share various traits, culture, and history, they also share a never-ending battle to maintain their own nationality. Ukraine specifically has always hoped to enjoy autonomy from Russia. Meanwhile, Russia has always hoped that Ukraine would stop trying to break away and come over to the Russian side of things instead. Russia has a historic tendency to not play well with others and will invade and annex any area they believe to be rightfully theirs, forcibly taking control of the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine in 2014, though most countries still recognize it as Ukrainian territory. Still, the annexation of Crimea started a long period of warfare between Russia and Ukraine, one that, as of early 2024, is still underway. The Holodomor technically began in 1928, when Soviet Union leader Joseph Stalin introduced the policy of agricultural collectivization. It started out as a consolidation of all Western privately owned Ukrainian farmland and livestock by order of the Soviets. Stalin's goal was to feed the industrial workers in the city and sell the grain abroad to finance industrialization. But once agricultural collectivism was written up in a 1933 issue of Pravda, the official Soviet Union newspaper, this policy seemed to turn into destroy Ukraine nationalism at all costs. Pavel Postishov, one of the architects of the Holodomor, more or less confirmed this secret motive when he gloated about destroying nationalist deviationism. That's the thing with history's evildoers. They have a tendency to say the quiet part out loud. At some point during the early 1930s, Stalin decided the Soviets should get all the food there was to be had, and began taking what he wanted from Ukrainian farmers. Kind of like the Hamburglar, if he had a mustache and was the head of a Soviet war machine. If you were a successful farmer who resisted Stalin's collectivization policies, you might be called a kulak, which in Russian translates to something like tight-fisted. Apparently, you're a real Scrooge if you don't hand over all your food to the Kremlin. But in the eyes of the kulaks themselves, Stalin's unreasonable demands were nothing more than a return to serfdom, because it seems that's more or less exactly what it was. But Stalin wasn't the type of guy who took criticism with humility and grace. Because of their objections and pushback, Soviet authorities branded the kulaks enemies of the working class and began a coordinated campaign to destroy them. The idea was to carry out an offensive against these steadfast farmers, break their resistance, eliminate them, and replace them with communist government-owned farms, which were called kolkhozes and sevkhozes. Before long, Stalin had implemented his dekulakization policy, where Soviet authorities were free to take land and food from these farmers. The lucky ones were shipped off to Siberia. The rest were left to starve, striving to find refuge in other countries. That was made all the harder by the Soviet Union blocking off their borders, not letting anyone in or out. In other words, the USSR created a famine trap and then locked everyone inside. When the government comes in and takes all the food, then leaves people trapped with little recourse, things quickly become desperate. So people were forced to get creative with their meals during the Holodomor. Snacks known as weed loafs were not uncommon to see, but they were not as fun as they might sound. Composed of nettle leaves and other weeds, the loaf was meant to sustain people as best it could, which, unfortunately, was not very much. To supplement, people would boil horse hides, eat manure, or even their own excrement out of desperation. And when that menu of horrors failed to suffice, starving peasants would usually turn on each other. That's right, many people resorted to the most extreme measures just to stay alive. When you're starving, your brain isn't necessarily thinking of much more than find food now. and it was not unheard of for parents to forsake their children and eat them, only to die of starvation themselves later. And while eating another person was still punishable by law, with over 2,000 people being arrested and charged during the Holodomor, the situation was so dire that black market human meat still became a commodity during the Atrocity.